When we first came here, there was nothing, and I do mean nothing, except oil wells.
Magic, absolute magic.
The West Coast, of course, was petrified. They were so scared another invasion might happen.
I'm actually standing on the actual elevator for a Nike missile.
And that was a big event and helped to put it on the map as an important base across the country.
Well, it was the greatest thing that ever happened to me.
The year was 1941. War raged throughout Europe and Asia, and many Americans feared that we too would be pulled into the fray. But no one was prepared for what happened on December 7th. 18 months earlier, President Franklin D. Roosevelt had transferred the United States fleet to Pearl Harbor in an effort to deter Japanese aggression. Now, the U.S., unprepared and considerably weakened, was abruptly pulled into the Second World War.
When Pearl Harbor was hit, the whole nation was shocked. All we could think about was getting in to the war as quickly as possible and getting it over as soon as possible.
And a little town called Torrance, California, located on the Pacific coast just 20 miles south of Los Angeles, found itself playing a role in that very effort with the construction of an Army airfield.
The West Coast, of course, was petrified. They were so scared another invasion might happen. Congress provided money to build roads and gun emplacements and airfields. And I think all told about 64 airfields were built, either built or taken over by the Army Air Force, Army Air Corps at the time. And this was one of them.
They called it the Lomita Flight Strip.
The first question I always get is, Lomita, aren't we in Torrance? Yes, we are in Torrance, but at that time, Torrance was about 14,000 people living all around the downtown area, and this was out in the boonies. This was 5-6 miles away from the populated Torrance. So Lomita was right nearby, so somehow or other the Corps of Engineers decided to call it Lomita Flight Strip.
The area didn't look like much of a place to build an airport.
There were open fields all the way over here. In fact, this was good soil because it was kind of a lake bed. And the people who had settled in this area were Japanese farmers, and it was farmed for its crops. And they raised flowers on the far side of the sand dunes, and over here they raised vegetables.
Well, there were Japanese farmers out here, so there was farmland all around Torrance, and then of course the oil wells. And the oil wells had to use water to cool something with, and they had big tanks of warm water, so that was our swimming pool.
The choice of location did seem unusual at first.
It was noted because of the PV Peninsula that it was very shielded from the winds and that kind of thing. The weather was good. So federal funds were provided to build an airstrip.
And the work of converting 490 acres of dirt and agricultural plots into a full-scale military base began.
The first effort was to bring the grade up. It was about 5 feet below grade. They had to bring in tons and tons of earth, 24 hours a day. Trucks were hauling stuff in from the PV Hill to bring this whole area, 490 acres, up to grade. Then a 5,000-foot airstrip was built by the state with the federal money. And that was probably completed about September of 42. Then from that time until March of 43, the Corps of Engineers began to build the rest of the field. They built the hard stands, the taxiways, the barracks, the hangars, all the rest of it.
By March 1943, the Lomita flight strip was open for business.
The first squadron that came in here as a unit was the 55th Pursuit Squadron, part of the 20th Fighter Group. They were deployed here from March Field in June of 1943, but they were only here for a couple of weeks or so. Then the next unit in here was a replacement training unit. That it was the 373rd Fighter Squadron that was here to train replacement pilots. And they were here from about July to December of 43.
And we would train new pilots who had gotten their wings, usually at Williams Air Force Base in Arizona, and then were transferred over to Lomita for operational training before they went overseas.
Redondo Beach native Iris Critchell found herself stationed in Long Beach, but transporting trainer fighter planes to the Lomita flight strip as a member of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, or WAFs.
Our WAFs and later WASPs were really part of the home front to carry out jobs that were needed here to release qualified pilots for combat and therefore flying overseas. And so we were hired as civilians.
Though they may have been civilians, these women played a key role in the war's home front effort.
Wherever there was a basic training school, they needed to supply these airplanes from the base where they were built. And so our main assignment that we ever expected to do was to fly the trainers and move them from the factory to the places where they were needed.
One of those places, of course, was the Lomita flight strip, a place Iris always felt at ease, and not just because she grew up down the road from the site.
It has a lovely, long, big runway, and we loved it because it was wide and it was long, and you could take off with the little tiny planes. We could take off and land several times on that and get lots of practice. And so it was very good for training, and we always felt very comfortable with it. And of course, it had open fields before the landing area and open fields along the sides, and they were raising vegetable crops and corn on the right-hand side. So it was a very safe and pleasant place to fly.
At Lomita, the men trained on the P-38 bomber, the most advanced fighter of the day.
P-38 is a twin-engine fighter. Configuration of it was twin booms, twin tail.
Earl Odie did not train at Lomita, but he did fly P-38s in Europe.
This is the cockpit here with the pilot in. These two side windows roll down, and this top panel opens and closes. There's a ladder in the back of the wing here that retracts, and we climb up on this ladder and crawl up on the wing to get in the airplane. These are the two engines, the propellers. These are our guns. This whole area here is full of the guns and the ammunition, and there are doors on the side that open up so the guns can be loaded. And as you can see, it's a tricycle gear airplane, which is great for pilots because they're very, very easy to land.
At Lomita, the men spent their days preparing to go off to war.
Besides flying, of course, the ground crew had to be trained. The mechanics and the personnel, the administrative people, everybody was in training. So there was a lot of ground training.
Most of the ground school was a gunnery ground school, teaching the pilots what aerial gunnery was all about, how you go about it, how do you shoot down an enemy airplane, what do you have to do?
Of course, training for combat meant more than just time in the classroom and in the air. The troops also had to get into top physical condition.
On March 7th, 1944, the entire base put on backpacks and steel helmets and hiked 6 miles up into the Palos Verdes wilderness, bivouacked overnight up there in a small grove of eucalyptus trees, and then the next day hiked back down. And they learned how to put up tents, how to camouflage.
The men also worked on their sharpshooting skills.
There was one time when one of the armorers found some 8-gauge shotguns, and they rounded up jeeps and drove around the largely open area here hunting jackrabbits. You know, I'm not much of a hunter, but it seemed to me that 8-gauge shotguns and running down rabbits with a jeep, I would call that meat hunting. That really isn't very sporty.
But with an average age of just over 19 years old, all work and no play was out of the question for these soldiers. Legend has it that in order to attract the attention of young ladies on the beach, the pilots would fly dangerously low over the surf. After enough residents complained, red numbers were painted on the planes so that the culprits could be easily identified. George Paddock, a squadron engineer, found love in a different way when he went to investigate the crash of a military plane into a house.
And while he was there, a young lady a couple of houses away came back from work. Her name was Lorraine Mettler, and their eyes met, and the chemistry was there instantly. They fell in love instantly. The photographer saw it, and he took a picture of the two of them standing on the porch.
When they weren't training or trying to meet cute girls, the men lived in barracks on the base.
Most of the enlisted men lived in these drafty wooden temporary barracks, complaining bitterly. They leaked, they were surrounded with mud, there were some wooden kind of sidewalks to keep their feet out of the mud, but it was only semi-successful.
Today, the Rolling Hill Shopping Center occupies the land where the barracks once stood. Those who could afford it found other places to live.
I talked to a couple of guys who moved into the Hilton Hotel in Long Beach and lived there. He said there was something called the Hi-Ho Club on the roof of the Hilton Hotel where Harry James Orchestra played, and Harry's wife, of course, was Betty Grable. She would come down from Hollywood in a limo to visit her husband when he was working, and the pilots would sit around the table and have a chance to chat with Betty Grable, and boy, if that wasn't something in World War II.
Though Hollywood was right up the street, the most famous person in Torrance may have been a young man named Louis Zamparini.
Who was Lou Zamparini? Well, he was an interesting fella. His family moved out here when he was a young boy and lived on Gramercy Street, just south of old downtown. Lou was in trouble constantly. He was one of these kids that just misbehaved constantly.
Well, of course, the Torrance police were always after me. Like my brother said, when the police car went south, I went north. But 9 chances out of 10, they figured out it was me.
One day, I think the thought occurred, why don't we put this kid on the track team or get him to run off some of this energy? So he joined the Torrance High School track team.
And the first track meet I ran, I came in last. I didn't care about winning, I just ran, and that was it. And then we had our first real meet against Narbonne, our enemy. And I'm in a 660-yard run. And coming down the home stretch, they had 3 runners, all ahead of me. And 2 had already finished. The third guy and I were heading for the tape. And I wasn't inspired to pass him until the kids in the grandstand were hollering, come on, Louie, from my hometown, my school. And I had no idea that anybody even knew my name. And that did it. I got inspired and I passed him and, came in third. but that tasted pretty good.
Lou was hooked and decided to dedicate himself to becoming a serious athlete.
And I trained hard, and I began to win.
And win, and win. In fact, Lou won a spot on the U.S. team of the 1936 Berlin Olympics, capturing the attention of fans back home and at least one well-known German.
I was the first American to finish the 5,000 meters. I was way behind the last lap. What I actually did, I sprinted the whole last lap, caught the leaders, but still came in 8th place. But seeing a person gain that much yardage was pretty exciting to the audience. And so Hitler saw it. I was invited over to meet Hitler, shook his hand, and all he said was the boy with the fast finish.
The boy with the fast finish returned home, and this time, the Torrance police weren't the only ones waiting for him.
Well, everything was a shocker to me. I got off the train, and the city of Torrance was there to greet me, and everybody was in the square in front of the old PE depot, and I was so embarrassed. It was terrible. And I had to say a few words, and then that was it. But every single person in town was there, including a friend of mine's mother who was in a wheelchair. And I thought that was, probably one of the greatest things that ever happened to me.
With his local celebrity status safely intact, Lou enrolled at USC, but upon graduation, he found the world was becoming a very different place. And by 1942, America was fully involved in World War II, and Lou signed up with the Army Air Corps, eventually being stationed in Hawaii.
And that was a pretty good assignment, being within 45 miles of Honolulu.
That is, until May 27th, 1943.
And the operations officer comes driving out in a Jeep, stops us, said, we got word that a B-25 has gone down 200 miles north of Palmyra. Would your crew, volunteer to go look for them? So we flew down to Palmyra, about 800 miles, and we began to scan the ocean where the B-25 last reported going down. And we're scanning the water for a life raft, debris or whatever, and then we had motor trouble. Number 1 went out, then number 2, the plane heeled over, crashed nose down, blew up, it exploded, it caught on fire. And out of 11 aboard the ship, 3 of us were able to get into a life raft, and then we started our drift for the next 47 days in the ocean. However, the tail gunner on the raft died on the 33rd day.
On day 47, the life raft floated into the Marshall Islands, where the 2 survivors were met by a Japanese patrol boat. Lou spent the next 2 years as a guest in several Japanese prisoner of war camps, conditions that were less than hospitable.
Unregistered, so you could die there and nobody would know it. And often I thought about, I'd rather be on the raft dying than in here.
With no word from Lou, his family received a traditional letter of condolence from President Roosevelt. But Lou survived and eventually made it back to the United States and to Torrance, and to a big surprise. Well aware that Lou had been listed as deceased, the Japanese government decided to ask the POW to make a radio broadcast announcing he was alive in 1945.
But it was so static that the government wouldn't accept it as me. But my family felt, even though they couldn't understand through the static, my sister wrote a letter to me on, I forget what they call it, the government mail. And it actually got to me in the slave labor camp. And she said, if you're alive, you can read this. The city of Torrance has named the airport Zamparini Field. And that was in 1945, summer. The war's not over. But when I got home, again, the city had a banquet for me. I felt kind of sheepish because there were a lot of my buddies that didn't come home alive.
The word got out that in Torrance that Lou was okay, he'd be coming home, and of course the city just went crazy. They planned a huge welcome home, a ticker tape parade kind of thing, and that's just what Lou got.
The date was December 7th, 1946, the 5th anniversary of Pearl Harbor and the beginning of the U.S. involvement in World War II, the perfect way to celebrate its end.
Okay, so they have an Academy Award actress down here, and guys from the studios. They had officers from Washington to come out here. So they did a double duty. They dedicated the field to Torrance and also named it Zamparini Field.
A stage was brought in, an elevated platform thing. There was a podium. There were chairs arranged on both sides of the podium for the dignitaries and the Zamparini family and so forth. Lou was here, his wife, his parents were sitting on, it would be stage right. His brother Pete and other dignitaries were strung out along stage left. Martha Walker, who was a Hollywood actress, was here. And it was a big deal. It made the front pages of the papers. But really all that happened was the city was getting permission to use the flight strip.
Which led to another bit of confusion.
Unfortunately, at that time, nobody bothered to tell the FAA that we were calling it Zamparini Field, so it never stuck. People began calling it the Torrance Airport, or the Torrance Municipal Airport, or something.
Which is just what the FAA thought it was called, leading to several false attempts to set things straight.
So then the pilots from the field here drew up a new resolution and asked that it be named Zamparini Field Torrance Municipal Airport. And this time they brought in the FAA, made it legal.
It was only, fairly recently, meaning in the last 10 years or so, I don't have the exact date, when the field was officially, meaning FAA records, dubbed Zamparini Field. And the monument was done out here at the entrance.
None of which takes away from the excitement Lou felt at the 1946 ceremony.
Well, of course, that was just on cloud nine. I mean, it's all this brass here from Washington and Marshfield, and they flew in for the occasion, and they gave the dedication papers to the city, and then honored me as having the field named after me. I'll tell you, it was the greatest thing that ever happened to me.
With the war over, America and Torrance went about the process of rebuilding. But after the last P-38 squadron had packed up and left, the field fell into disuse.
One of the more interesting things is at the end of 45, the Japanese Americans who had been interred in camps around the country were returning to their homes here in Southern California. They moved in 85 trailers for that purpose, and the returnees were housed here in barracks and the administrative buildings and the mess halls and stuff, and plus these trailers. I think it got to 600 or 800 internees. The purpose was for them to have a temporary place to stay and live before they found their own homes or were able to find a more permanent location for their own families.
That wasn't the only use found for the old drafty barracks.
It turned out that no one really cared much about the rest of the field, the runways, all that stuff. No, it was those buildings they wanted. One of the funniest stories was a guy who ran a university. He called it a university. It was a building at Flower and Olympic in downtown LA. And he wanted these buildings to expand his university. He couldn't produce courses or topics or whatever he was going to teach, so his request was turned down. Finally, as a result of the Civil Aeronautics Administration recommending that airports be maintained as airports, the War Assets Administration decided they would allow the city of Torrance to take over the use of the airstrip, the one 5,000-foot airstrip.
The year was 1948.
And the first thing they did, as cities do, is prepare a master plan. I believe it came out in October, and they had envisioned the second runway here. They had envisioned commercial businesses along Pacific Coast Highway. What later became the Rolling Hills Shopping Center, that was set aside. Crenshaw Boulevard, which had not come any farther south than Sepulveda, was now cut through all the way to PCH and on up a little bit into the PV area.
After the war, they began to build business on the southern end of the avenues, and Avenue I and Catalina Avenue became business centers, and Palos Verdes Boulevard. And so where I used to live went away.
Aviation was taking off, and many universities offered returning servicemen the chance to fly as civilians.
They wanted these 4 courses that would enable veterans to come out of the service, use their veterans' benefits, and get the civilian ratings so they could perhaps be employed in the civilian aviation world, many going with the airlines.
At the same time, businesses began to set up shop at Zamparini Field.
Acme Aircraft came here in October 1945, and at that time I was one of a handful of people on the Torrance Airport. Then, little by little, as business built up, times got better, we did a little more work, and we branched out into various kinds of work. We would buy surplus airplanes and convert them into our use, where we could turn them over and make a living at it.
Even if the area didn't look like much.
When we first came here, there was nothing, and I do mean nothing, except oil wells. You could look from the big hangar where we were, north, south, east, or west, and there were nothing but oil wells around. Then, of course, we flew a few airplanes, so they were around, and little by little, things built up. So there were more airplanes, more people, and we had more to do, and things kind of kept going up and up and up and up.
In fact, business was going very well.
Acme Aircraft started in with one, that was myself, Roger Keeney. Then we eventually grew to about 50 employees, and found that that was very unwieldy, trying to control all of that. So we slowly readjusted and found that probably between a dozen and 2 dozen employees was very easy to handle, and so we stayed about that.
The airport was becoming a more and more popular destination with pilots.
After the war, I did a lot more flying off the Torrance Airport, and I just checked my logbooks between 1945 and 1962, and I have nearly 600 operations of takeoffs and landings involved.
Some of those operations were during what was called the Powder Puff Derby, an annual cross-country race sponsored by a group of women known as the 99s.
The 1960 race was started here at Torrance Airport, and then in 1967 that race finished here at Torrance Airport. And that was a big event and helped to put it on the map as an important base across the country.
Which attracted a lot more visitors to the field.
People from the outside, the laymen, more or less we call them, come to the airport, and in the old days there were no fence around, so they would come in and ask questions, and what were we doing, and you know, what could they do to get a ride? And were their children able to come on the airport and look at the airplanes?
Anyone who did visit the airport might have come across